Welcome, and it is my honor to introduce to you this evening 13 students who have worked very hard starting this summer under their community mentors. They did research, and then this fall they returned to campus and have been taking a class with me where they've been learning how to write an in-depth research paper and also put together the presentations that you are about to listen to. One key thing about the Honors Independent Research Study is that it would not be possible without the generosity of community members in Memphis that give their time and their expertise in teaching our students, in introducing them to different career paths, and just having them experience what those professions are like. So to start, I really want to give a round of applause to all of the mentors, some of whom are here this evening, some who are listening online, but to acknowledge that none of this would be possible without their help and input. And with that, we will begin tonight's program with 7 of the students presenting. We will then take a short break. Please join us in the lobby, have a few snacks, and then we'll come back in around 15 minutes after we break. We will have the last 6 students and then wrap up the evening. So again, I thank you for being here and enjoy all that you are about to hear. They have worked very hard and I am very proud of all of them.
Good evening. My name is Alicia Awan, and this summer I worked with Dr. Jason Chandler at the West Cancer Clinic, where I measured patient response to CAR T-cell immunotherapy and medications for multiple myeloma. So in the United States, there are about 20 million new cases of cancer annually. And what cancer is an abnormal cell growth where it grows and spreads uncontrollably in a specific tissue or organ in the body. And all cancers have different types of treatments, and unfortunately, several of these treatments might have different negative side effects. Some examples are different medications and different types of therapies, such as radiation therapy, chemotherapy, and immunotherapy. I specifically looked at multiple myeloma, which in the US, there are about 36,000 new cases annually. It is a cancer in the red bone marrow where plasma cells are made. It's a cancer of the plasma cells, where plasma cells are the ones that grow and spread uncontrollably. And a plasma cell is a type of lymphocyte. So a lymphocyte is a white blood cell, and there are 2 main types of white blood cells. There's T cells and B cells. T cells are lymphocytes that can directly kill infected cells or pathogens or antigens, which are foreign substances to the body, or they can help B cells, which is the other type of lymphocyte, which produce antibodies to kill antigens and pathogens. So specifically for multiple myeloma, I looked at immunotherapy and a specific type of drug. So I looked at CAR T-cell immunotherapy, and how this works is a patient goes to a lab and their cells are collected in an apheresis machine. And then the T cells, which are the lymphocytes, are separated from the blood and sent to a separate lab. And in that lab, scientists will take a chimeric antigen receptor, which is a specific type of gene, and they bind it to the T cell. And this allows the T cell to go and kill any infected myeloma cells. And then those cells they're multiplied in the lab and then sent back where they are reinfused into the patient's body and can then attack the myeloma cells. Additionally, patients might receive a medication called teclistamab, which is a bispecific antibody that can kill myeloma cells. And bispecific antibody means that it can bind to 2 different substances. So it binds to the myeloma cell and it will bind a T cell to be able to kill the myeloma cell. So unfortunately, like I said earlier, a lot of types of cancer treatments have potential negative side effects. In this case, the 2 that I saw were cytokine release syndrome and immune effector cell-associated neurotoxicity syndrome, or ICANS. CRS is when the immune system floods the bloodstream with a bunch of cytokines, and cytokines are small proteins that act as chemical messengers from the immune system. So the influx in the bloodstream of cytokines can cause several different symptoms, such as high fevers above 38 degrees Celsius, hypotension, hypoxia, and an increase or decrease in the levels of different proteins, such as CRP or ferritin. ICANS is the neurological response to the immune response, in which symptoms may include general brain damage, memory loss, or in severe cases, even like stroke. And to combat both of these side effects, patients will be administered a medication called dexamethasone, or if symptoms are severe enough, tocilizumab. So my role in the lab was to collect different points of data to calculate the severity of their CRS and ICANS. And the way that I did that was by giving them a CRS grade and an ICANS score. So for CRS, I would look at their levels of hypotension, hypoxia, whether or not they had a fever, and their CRP and ferritin levels, and assign them on a grading scale from 1 to 4, with 4 being the most severe and 1 being the least. And for ICANS, they were given a neurological exam with several brain tests, which I could place them on a scale from 0 to 9, with 9 being the best performance and 0 being the worst. This is an example of a patient database that I looked at to collect all of my data. There were 2 main databases I looked at in addition to their neurological tests. And then I collected all the information on a spreadsheet where I looked at 50 different patients who received the treatments, and I would record their dosage of teclistamab, their CRP and ferritin levels, whether or not they had a fever, and then also look at their neurological test data to assign them a CRS grade and an ICANS score. And this would allow me to see how severe their symptoms were, so that I could see what dose of either dexamethasone or tocilizumab they were receiving, which I would also record. So research for this specific treatment plan is still ongoing, but from the 50 patients that I tracked, results so far have seemed promising because there were no CRS grades above 2 or I scores below 7, which shows that so far their symptoms have been at a minimum. So this shows promising results for future multiple myeloma patients. I'd like to acknowledge again Dr. Jason Chandler at West Cancer Center, Dr. Soren, and all of my HERS classmates. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Eleanor Chandler, and over the summer, I worked with Professor Hussey at the University of Memphis in the Economics Department to research NCAA infractions, penalty predictions, and fairness pre and post 2013. So the NCAA is an organization that controls all of college athletics, and they have legislative and administrative control, which means they create the rules and then they enforce them. So the NCAA is ruled by the board of directors, and then it's split into 4 different committees. But the only committees that are relevant to this project are the Infractions Process Committee, the Committee on Infractions,
We're
and
not
the
going to
Infractions.
listen to this.
Yeah.
But this is the
So
girl, and the
infractions
way they've got the
an
camera.
institution
You
makes
missed
the
the
rules
face?
set by
You
the
missed most
NCAA.
of her face.
So
in
some
the
common
video.
examples
It
are
was
lack of
wearing
institutional
on the Google Meet.
unethical conduct or recruiting violations. And here's a common example of NCAA infractions in the news. Recently, Michigan was involved in a sign stealing scandal, and because all of the reports are made public, you often see them in the news. And so in 2013, there were some changes in the NCAA. So infractions went from being described in 2 tiers to being described in 4 tiers. The Committee on Infractions went from including 10 members to up to 24. There's now a lawyer on the Committee on Infractions, and there's more head coach accountability overall, and there's a more streamlined infractions process. So the infractions process all starts with an alleged infraction, and then there's investigation by the enforcement staff. And if there's not an infraction to be found, then there's no infraction and the case is closed. But if there is, it either goes to a summary disposition or negotiate a resolution. And all of these have the opportunity for appeal. And all 3
It's 6 o'clock. It's now.
and here's a
It's going
snapshot
on
of
now.
the
But
video
she's not
infraction
going to
from
be there the
2021.
first month.
So they're
So I
randomly
can start
selected in
to. She's
2007
going to text
different
us when
cases,
she's going to be
and
in
they
the
serve
second
3-year
group.
terms up to 3 terms. And so from 2000 up to 2021, I looked at over 100 Committee on Infractions members because they change so often. So the Committee on Infractions prescribes penalties by looking at the level and the factors of the case. So for the level, this is describing the infraction. 1 is the least severe and 4 is the most severe. And for factors, these are outside factors of the case. So for aggravated, this is if a college has had multiple level 4 violations in the past.
I
Mitigated
can't watch it
is if a college has had 1 or 2 level 2 violations in the past, they self-report it. And standard is if there's no aggravated or mitigated. So a combination of the level and the factors gives the infractions committee their penalties. So I examined if the changes made in 2013 increased the fairness of the NCAA infractions process. I asked, can infractions properly predict penalties? And does diversity of the Committee on Infractions affect penalty outcome? And does conference affiliation of the Committee on Infractions members affect penalty outcome? So here's an example of my data on the Committee on Infractions members. So we have just an example of 4 of the people that were possibly on the case, and out of these 4, Dennis Thomas was on the case. But again, I researched over 130 members, so this row would extend. And here's data on infraction type. So 3 years of probation were involved in this case, along with postseason ban, recruiting restrictions, show cause, financial aid reduction, but vacation of record was not included. And here's data on conference affiliation of the Committee on Infractions members. So here's the actual infraction school itself, and then here's the chair's school affiliations and the corresponding conferences, and then the whole committee's school affiliations and the corresponding conferences. And here is the conference of the actual infraction school itself, which in this case is Alabama A&M. And if there's an exact school match between the infraction school and one of the committee members' school affiliations, there's a 1 there. And if there's a match between the infraction school's conference and one of the committee members' conferences, there's a 1 there. And if there's a match between the conference affiliation of the school and the chair's conference affiliation, there's a 1 there. And here's data on the percent female of the Committee on Infractions. So using that data, we regressed different infractions against penalties to see if different infractions could properly predict penalties. And we had 3 different specifications. We controlled for characteristics of case, number of sports involved, Power 5 conference, and probation status. We also controlled for women's sport involved and percent female on the COI. So you can see here, there's a very strong positive relationship between academic ineligibility and probation years, and that is the same no matter the specification. So it didn't matter if a women's sport was involved or if there was percent female on the COI. So this tells us that academic ineligibility is very likely to predict probation years. And same here with lack of institutional control. You can see that there's a very strong positive relationship no matter the specification. So that tells us that lack of institutional control is very likely to predict probation years. And the same is true for the failure to promote, which is very likely to predict recruitment restrictions no matter the specification involved. And here we look at show cause, which is a fairly unique penalty because it's very specific to head coaches. It's basically given to the head coach so they don't leave their school and avoid their penalty altogether. So you can see here that there is a very strong positive relationship between unethical conduct and show cause, but there's actually a negative relationship between exceeding financial aid and show cause. And this might be because unethical conduct could be very specific to a head coach, while exceeding financial aid could be specific to the entire athletic department. So overall, it's important that these different infractions can predict penalties because it tells us that the infractions process is fair and it's streamlined in the way it's supposed to be. So now we're looking at the impact of diversity on the Committee on Infractions. So we took the residuals from the last regression and we regressed them against percent female. And what we have here is a prediction of absolute residuals or unexplained variance. And unexplained variance is variance that can't be explained. So we don't want this number to be super low because all of these cases are so different. So we're going to expect them to vary a little, but you also don't want it to be high. So anytime you see a negative number here, it means there's a decrease in unexplained variance. And you see that here with percent non-white and postseason ban and vacation of record and percent female. So that tells us that increased diversity on the Committee on Infractions actually makes the infractions process more fair because the unexplained variance is decreasing. And here is unexplained variance over time, pre-2013 versus post-2013, and you can see an overall decrease, which tells us that the infractions process did get more fair with the changes made in 2013. And this is just for the penalty financial reduction, but we did this for all 5 penalties we've researched. This is just one example of the graph. And now here we're looking at conference affiliation of the committee members. And you can see here that there is a strong positive relationship between probation and infraction school and committee match, and show cause and infraction school and chair match. But it's hard to take anything away from this graph because so many of these members have like 10 different conference affiliations. So it's hard to know which one they favor or which one matters the most. So there's not much that we can take away from this graph. So overall, the changes in 2013 helped make the infractions process more fair. And we know this because we were able to predict different penalties based on their infractions. Additionally, the overall unexplained variance decreased, which means the infractions process were more fair. I'd like to thank Dr. Andrew Hussey, Dr. Annabeth Soren, and my Harris class.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Quinn. Over the summer, I worked in Dr. Gary Boland's lab in the Biomedical Engineering Department of the University of Memphis, investigating spironolactone-loaded nanofibrous membranes to potentially treat hormonal acne. So hormonal acne in women is caused by sex hormone fluctuations, specifically fluctuations in androgens. And an androgen is any male hormone, like testosterone, for example. And one treatment that targets androgen specifically is spironolactone. So spironolactone is used on label for high blood pressure and heart disease, but because of its anti-androgen effect, it's able to be used off-label to effectively treat hormonal acne in women. But currently, it's only taken orally via capsules or liquid suspension, which causes gastrointestinal issues. There are three main drug delivery methods: enteral, parenteral, and topical. Enteral is anything swallowed, like capsules, tablets, or liquids. Parenteral is anything injected or implanted, like an IV or a subcutaneous implant or injection. And topical is anything absorbed through the skin, like creams or patches. And electrospinning and touch spinning are both methods of fiber fabrication that produce biocompatible and biodegradable membranes that make them viable for parenteral and topical methods of drug delivery. And that's why electrospinning was one of my possible methods of administering spironolactone, and it has various applications beyond drug delivery, but my study focuses in on drug delivery. And the way electrospinning works is you have a polymer solution loaded into a syringe with a needle gauge attached, and the needle gauge is also attached to a voltage supply, and the whole syringe is put into a syringe pump. So as the syringe pump is pumping out the solution and the voltage supply the voltage is also going through the solution, a jet of fiber is drawn from the tip of the needle gauge and travels to the collector plate. And as it's traveling to the collector plate, the solvent from the solution evaporates, leaving just the polymer, which leaves a fibrous membrane. And on the right here is the electrospinner that I used in Dr. Boland's lab. And touch spinning is a very recently developed way of fiber fabrication that does not use electricity, which means there are a lot less parameters to control. And this was another possible way of administration that I chose. And the way touch spinning works is there's also a syringe loaded with a polymer solution and a needle gauge and a syringe pump. But instead of electricity, there are these two glass rods that spin on this rotating stage. And so as the bead of polymer solution at the tip of the needle gets pumped out, it gets caught onto these glass rods, drawing out fibers and depositing it onto the mandrel, which is moving up and down via a crank to ensure even deposition of the fibers. And on the left is an example of an electrospun sample that I used, and on the right is an example of a touch spun sample. For the polymer solution itself, my base polymer was polydioxanone, PDO, in a solution with hexafluoro-2-propanol, HFP, as the solvent. And I used 0, 10, 20, 30% spironolactone concentrations to test. And for each solution, I let them dissolve overnight at room temperature. These are all the parameters that I used for electrospinning and touch spinning. And as you can see, electrospinning has a lot more parameters than touch spinning. This is a standard curve that I calculated by reading a serial dilution with a spectrophotometer of spironolactone, starting from 20 milligrams per milliliter going down to 0. And the standard curve shows that for every increase in concentration, there's a constant increase in absorbance. So when you read a solution you're able to figure out the absorbance and therefore
Just
figure out
bother me
the.
that I can't make the
And I
picture.
use the standard curve to
Well,
see
they've moved the
the
camera a little. I see this kid a little bit better. Yeah, now they must have moved the camera because at
And
least you
for
can
the
see their whole
samples that I
face.
tested, I used 6 millimeter punch outs for the electrospun samples and 4 millimeter punch outs for the touch spun, because the electrospun samples had a lot more surface area than the touch spun. So I was able to use bigger punch outs. The time points that I chose were 30 minutes,
That's
1
you and
hour,
me.
3 hours, 6 hours, and 24 hours.
There'd be a way you
And
can put that
I
picture
would
on
put
the whole
each sample
screen.
in a
Yeah,
5
you
to
would,
6
but
well
I have
plate,
no
and then
idea.
in each well that a sample was in, I put a 1-to-1 mixture of Hanks balanced salt solution, HBSS, and ethanol. And then I would put the well plate in an incubator set at 37 degrees Celsius to mimic body temperature. And at each time point, we would remove the sample, and then at time points 3 hours, 6 hours, and 24 hours, we would remove half of each well to read with the spectrophotometer. And after reading with the spectrophotometer, I was able to calculate the absorbance through the through the standard curve mentioned earlier. And so I was able to calculate this graph. And as you can see with this graph, 10% and 30% both show signs of a burst release, which means that in the beginning stages of elution, a majority of the drug is eluted out. But with 20%, we're kind of unsure with what happened, and there would need to be further testing to have conclusive evidence. And with the touch, and this is a graph just for the electrophone samples going up to 3 hours, because the touch one samples and 6 hours and 24 hours for the electros one samples, the data still needs to be analyzed and assessed. On the left is the stemming electron picture of my 30% spironolactone electros one sample. And sorry, on the left. And on the right is an SEM of a normal electros one sample. And as you can see with my sample, there are a lot of chunks throughout the fibers, which are chunks of spironolactone and could possibly indicate, be an indicator of the burst release happened. Whereas if it were more evenly distributed in the right, there could have been a more instant release rate. And so in conclusion, data that I got from this summer are the very preliminary steps of this, so it would be hard to tell what method would be best. And something important to do in the future would be to find fiber size and density to see how much drug actually eluted out rather than just the concentration, to further tailor the administration strategies like implantable or topical mentioned earlier, and it would show which strategy would be best going forward. I would like to thank Dr. Gary Bolin, Samantha Hull, and my University of Memphis lab mates, Dr. Anna Bestorin, and my HERS classmates.
I thought I recall him saying that the
Hi, my name is Quinn Farabee, and over the summer I
Here's a
worked
new
in the
girl.
Rose chemistry with Dr. Laren Peterson, synthesizing compounds for the inhibition of
We must be
catechol
where they stand,
methyltransferase,
because this girl, the
dopamine
top of her
systemic
head's
enzyme
off.
that is
The other
involved
girl, we
in
had the full face.
Parkinson's disease is the second most common disease of the central nervous system, and its frequency increases with age. You can see the increase starts around age 50 and hits its peak around age 85. It's characterized by motor control issues, most notably tremors, and its exact causes are unknown, but it does correspond with dopamine deterioration and dopamine deficiency. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, meaning it sends nerve impulses throughout the body, and its structure is a catechol-amine, meaning it's a hexagonal benzene ring connected to two hydroxyl groups, as well as an amine group off to the side. And it's produced and broken down through a variety of different enzymatic reactions in the body. Enzymes are biological molecules that help facilitate biological reactions in the body. And the way an enzymatic process works is the substrate molecule, or the ligand, binds to the active site of the enzyme where catalysis occurs. And then at the end of the reaction, the product, which was once the substrate, is released from the enzyme. Additionally, sometimes there's a co-substrate molecule which will bind to the active site along with the substrate and undergo catalysis. And then at the end of the reaction, it would be released just the same. Competitive inhibitors block the active site from and prevent the enzymatic reaction from occurring. So the inhibitor would bind to the active site, getting in the way of the substrate and inhibiting the reaction from happening. The specific enzyme I looked at was catechol O-methyltransferase, or COMT, which is an enzyme that breaks down different catechol amines like dopamine in the human body. There are two forms, the soluble form and the membrane-bound form, with the soluble form being mostly in the peripheral nervous system, and the membrane-bound form being involved in dopamine and catecholamine regulation in the central nervous system, making it more relevant in my research. So off to the side, you can see the structure of the enzyme. It's a dimerized enzyme, meaning there are two subunits with two separate active sites right there. And then this image just shows a closer up picture of one of the chains of COMT with the active site as the magnesium ion there, and then the co-substrate called SAM in orange. Additionally, binded to the active site right now is a known inhibitor called BIE in pink. So the way the COMT reaction works is that it transfers the methyl group from its co-substrate SAM to the hydroxyl group of the dopamine, producing methoxytyramine. And this reaction regulates dopamine levels in the central nervous system. So when the enzyme is too active, it can lead to dopamine deficiency, which is where it's thought that Parkinson's can come in. COMT inhibitors can reduce excessive deterioration of dopamine, and currently inhibitors are coupled with L-DOPA as treatment for Parkinson's. L-DOPA is a precursor for dopamine, so it's converted into dopamine, and then the inhibitor will decrease dopamine consumption. So the hope is that by administering both of these drugs simultaneously, dopamine levels will be regulated from both the production and the consumption side. Current inhibitory drugs include entacapone and tolcapone, but they're not effective long-term because of their short half-lives in the human body, meaning that quickly after they're administered, they're absorbed and their effects will not last very long. For my project, I focused on synthesizing compounds with cyano and nitro group additions because these functional groups are highly electronegative, and compounds with electronegative substituents are effective inhibitors of the enzyme because they pull electron density away from the rest of the molecule, allowing the molecule to bind to the active site and better inhibit enzymatic activity. So I synthesized 3 different compounds, and then afterwards I used an online docking program to predict how well the inhibitors would bind to the active site of the enzyme and inhibit activity. For the synthesis, I did 2 nitrations, which is adding a nitro group to the molecule to produce 6 nitrodopa and 5 nitrovanillin. And then I did 1 acetylation of DMPEA, which would be the first step in the synthesis of 6-cyanodopamine. For the percent yields, I got 26.1% for nitrodopa, 83.4% for nitrovanillin, and 58.2% for NADMPEA, which that percentage is just the amount of products that we made based on the amount of reactant that we started with. Afterwards, I used an online docking program called Webina, which allows us to predict how successfully the compound will inhibit enzymatic activity. And for this, we just uploaded a structure of the inhibitor molecule as well as a structure of the enzyme. And then the program generated an image of the inhibitor binded to the active site of the enzyme, as well as a list of docking scores that just provide a numerical value for how well the enzyme's activity will be inhibited. So first, we redocked the original inhibitor ligand BIE just to compare how the program would show orientation compared to how it was oriented in the original structure. So here's the list of docking scores using BIE as kind of the comparison. And the affinity is goes from least to greatest, with least being the best potential for binding, meaning that it would inhibit the enzyme the best. So first we have nitrodopa, followed by nitrovanillin, and then cyanodopamine. And then the affinity difference is just the difference in docking scores relative to BIE, which was that standard. In conclusion, I synthesized nitrovanillin and NADMPEA, and I would need to follow 5 more steps to fully synthesize cyanodopamine. I also synthesized nitrodopa, which showed the most promising inhibition potential according to Webina, but because of that low percent yield at 26.1%, I would need to improve the procedure for more consistency and better yield for use in the future. Next, we would also look into more reliable and consistent docking methods, including enzyme crystallography, which just shows a much more detailed picture and prediction for inhibition of the enzyme, because obviously the computational program is cost-effective and very convenient, but not totally accurate. This project is important because effective inhibitors can lead to the creation of improved drugs for Parkinson's in the future. Lastly, I'd like to thank Dr. Peterson, as well as my Rhodes lab mates, Mrs. Wright, Dr. Soren, and my Hearst classmates. Thank you.
Hello, my name is McNairn Gray, and I worked at the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders at the University of Memphis under Dr. Naomi Eichhorn, and my project was the role of attention bias in stuttering. So for little background, stuttering impacts approximately 80 million adults globally, and 5 to 10% of preschoolers are affected by stuttering and face negative social impact like teasing or bullying. And we conduct this study to raise awareness to the fact that children could be developing anxiety around their stuttering, which can then affect their mental health and hinder their development, and we want to get some intervention for this.
And so this study does not include neurogenic or psychogenic stuttering, neurogenic stuttering being stuttering as a result of a physical trauma and psychogenic stuttering being a result of a mental trauma. This study focuses on persisting developmental stuttering, which is onset in early childhood in that 5 to 10% of preschoolers. It is the atypical development of speech motor control areas, and it commonly presents as sound and syllable repetitions, prolongations, and blocks. And so looking at this chart here, broken words would be open, prolongations, my, part repetitions, but. And so for the attention bias, it is the prioritization of certain stimuli over others, and this can present as a hypervigilance or avoidance towards certain stimuli. And looking at these pie charts, we can see that our environment presents us with many different, lots of information, but our brains can only perceive and process so much of that. And this is where attention bias comes into play. And so looking at an example, if a person is walking alone in the woods, they may be nervous about that. And so if they hear sounds like crunching leaves or cracking branches, they may have a hypervigilance towards that and notice those sounds, whereas they may not normally notice those things in daily life. And this brings me to the point that effects of attention bias are larger when threats are disorder congruent. And we see this a lot in people with social anxiety, them having a hypervigilance towards words like dumb, stupid, or negative facial expressions. And this means that they could have heightened effects of anxiety around their disorder. And if we put this in the context of this particular study, we are studying whether people with stutters have that hypervigilance or avoidance towards words on which they anticipate stuttering. And if they have that heightened attention bias, they could also potentially develop an anxiety around their stuttering, which could lead to a cyclical relationship between attention bias, stuttering, and anxiety. And so our hypotheses were, one, a larger impact of attention bias will be observed in people who stutter than in people who do not stutter. And in people who stutter, stuttering-related stimuli will result in heightened attention bias. And it is important to note while the adult study is still ongoing, and I don't have data to present today, but the methods that we are currently using are conducted in 2 sessions, the first being a recorded session on Microsoft Teams. This consisted of consent forms, speech syllable collection, which was just a personal interview in which we asked them about their daily lives until 300 syllables of speech were collected. We asked them to describe pictures until 300 syllables of speech were collected, and we asked them to read a couple of passages until 300 syllables of speech were collected. And we ended the Teams recording with a personal word collection. We asked the control group or the non-stuttering group to give us words that they encounter in their daily lives. So for me, that would be words like school, computer, or work. And for our stuttering or experimental group, we asked them to give us about 20 words that they anticipate stuttering on. And we used this data in the in-person session with our main experiment of eye tracking with words. And this task was conducted in 6 trials. And if we look at this box here, the big box represents a computer screen that they were shown 24 times in each trial. And each time the screen had four different words on them, and we pulled those words from the personal word collection. And those words would have a match with them of similar length or tone. And we were examining this to see whether their eyes rested on certain words or avoided them to see those attention bias patterns. And then we just followed this task with 2 IQ tests to validate the data. And so what is next? While I mentioned before the adult study is still ongoing, what is important is that Dr. Eichhorn recently launched the children's study. And like I mentioned before, this is important because we want to ensure that that children are authentic in their communication and feel comfortable being themselves and have a positive self-image. And so we also want to raise awareness to the fact that because of this anxiety, we can get interventions and therapies for stuttering so they don't continue to develop that. And I would like to acknowledge Dr. Naomi Eichhorn and Dr. Edna Bene in the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders, and Dr. Soren and all of my fellow Hearst classmates.
Okay, hi, my name is Celine Kim, and over the summer I worked at the University of Memphis Biomedical Engineering Department under Dr. Joel Baumgartner to develop electrospun chitosan-based materials for biomedical implant and tissue engineering applications. So for some background, over 2.5 million tissue transplants are performed annually worldwide, and gum disease is a very common disease that uses tissue transplants as a form of treatment. More than 42% of adults older than 30 have some form of gum disease, and within that, 8% are on the severe side. And this increases with age as 60% of adults 65 years and older have some form of gum disease. There are different transplants such as autograft transplants, which is when one's own tissues and organs are being transplanted back into themselves, and allograft transplants, which is when another person's tissues and organs are being transplanted to another person. However, this has risks of infection, and with allograft, there's immune rejections. So tissue engineering is a method that uses cells or biomaterials to overcome these limitations. There are scaffold-free and scaffold-based approaches for tissue engineering. Scaffolds are temporary structures to support cell formation and tissue regeneration. Chitosan is a biomaterial that is used in tissue engineering, and it's a deacylated product of chitin, and chitin is derived from the exoskeletons of crustaceans. And chitosan is used in tissue engineering because of its biodegradability, biocompatibility, and non-toxicity in the body, and it is also soluble in acidic solutions. Electrospinning is a method to create scaffolds by pumping a polymer solution out of a syringe and using an electrostatic field to generate fibers from the polymer solution that are then collected on a collector's plate. And this can help create 3D membrane shapes. So at Dr. Baumgartner's lab, we create guided bone regeneration membrane scaffolds for dental implants to provide a barrier to prevent soft tissue infiltration and preserve a space for bone regeneration. And this is a widely used bone graft application, as approximately 50% of all dental implants are a guided bone regeneration membrane. At Dr. Baumgartner's lab, we use chitosan as the solute and trifluoroacetic acid as the solvent. And trifluoroacetic acid is a strong corrosive acid. The membranes have to be treated in order to prevent fiber swelling and improve their behavior in aqueous or water environments, as your body is an aqueous environment. And the treatment is a 50-50 pyridine and hexanoic anhydride solution. And after the membranes are in the treatment for 1.5 hours, they are then put in deionized water for 3 days in order to remove any excess treatment or any excess solution, and the water is replaced every 24-hour period. However, there are environmental concerns when using TFA and the chemicals in the membrane treatment because they are resistant to degradation and can contaminate water spaces. So my goal was to find a more environmentally friendly, TFA-free way of electrospinning and creating these membranes. So I first tested different solutions, 13, with varying amounts of chitosan and different solvents that are more environmentally friendly, such as formic acid and acetic acid. And I would I would measure their viscosity in a viscometer. And for reference, a successful electrospinning solution's viscosity is between 100 to 2,000 centipos. So here are the results for 0.5 weight volume percent of chitosan and different concentrations of acetic and formic acid. And as you can see, the viscosities are a lot lower than the ideal electrospinning solution viscosity. However, as we increase the concentration, the viscosity also increases, and by 2 weight volume percent, the solutions are reaching a more ideal electrospinning viscosity. I also tested UV cross-linking. So chemical cross-linkers form covalent or ionic bonds between polymer chains, creating a more rigid structure. And UV cross-linking specifically uses ultraviolet light to break and form these bonds. And this is to possibly replace the treatment, as cross-linking helps enhance wet stability and improve the mechanical properties of the membrane, and also can possibly save time, as the solution takes like 3+ days, while this could take mere hours. I would first place the membranes under a UV lamp for varying amounts of time, and then I would put them in water and test the amount of time it took for the membranes to become translucent, transparent, and dissolved. And ideally, the membranes should eventually become hydrophobic and not become translucent and transparent, because this is an indication that water is getting into the fibers. And after 10 minutes, undissolved membranes were taken out and saved to examine the fibers. However, I do not have this data at this moment. So with the time to become translucent, there was not much variation between the benzophenone concentrations. And also they just immediately became translucent when they hit the water. So that was not ideal. And however, for transparent, the increasing concentration of benzophenone made the members take more time to become transparent. So for solutions, this shows that there are plausible alternatives to electrospin these membranes without using TFA. However, the next step is to actually spin these solutions and test if these membranes can be used for dental implants. And also UV cross-linking, there may be different methods used, such as using the UV lamp when the fiber itself is being electrospun. However, this also still needs to be tested. I would like to thank Dr. Joel Baumgartner, Professor of Biomedical Engineering at the University of Memphis, along with graduate student Alex Bryan, for helping me throughout this entire experience, along with Nikin and Chevy, Dr. Soren, and my Hearst classmates.
Hi, I'm Molly Kirschbaum, and this past summer, I performed research at the Rhodes College Economics Department with Professor Courtney Collins, and we researched the effect of test optional policies on college enrollment, admissions, and applications. So standardized testing was first introduced with the Scholastic Aptitude Test, the SAT, first administered in 1926, and then the ACT was another standardized test introduced in 1959. And these were both created as objective measures of academic ability at a time when college admissions was primarily based on wealth and socioeconomic status. And both of these tests contributed to a holistic review process, which is the assessment of an applicant based on their entire profile instead of just a couple of factors. And so with this rise of standardized testing came lots of criticism, as these tests didn't level the playing field for students as the test creators and as colleges had anticipated. And this was seen with score variance among different racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. And this was mainly due to unequal access to test prep among these different groups. And so because of this, many colleges adopted test optional admissions policies in order to make their review process more holistic, as the standardized tests didn't do so as much as they would have liked, and also to increase their diversity. And so Bates College was one of the first institutions to adopt a test optional admissions policy, and they performed a 20-year-long research study starting in 1984, where their admitted students would submit test scores upon matriculation into Bates, whether or not they submitted their test scores originally with their application. And they found that their non-submitters actually had higher graduation rates than their submitters by 0.01%, even though their submitters had a higher average SAT score, showing that submitting versus non-submitting a test score doesn't necessarily affect graduation rates or college success. And so with the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a very large switch to test optional admissions nationwide, with nearly 2,000 schools switching to test optional admissions, as you can see in this graph. And then this was caused mainly by a lack of access to testing centers nationwide because of health and safety protocols during the pandemic, and also a loss of fee waivers for many students because of the economic impacts of the pandemic. And so the two research questions of my study were, one, what predicts if a school chooses to become test optional, and two, how are other aspects of a school affected after the school switches to test optional admissions? So the first half of my summer, I performed an in-depth literature review where I looked at several journal and news articles about test optional admissions and different research studies, such as the Bates College study I mentioned earlier. And the second half of my research was data collection and analysis. We collected the data from IPEDS, the Integrated Post-Secondary Education System, and then we merged this data and thoroughly cleaned it to prepare for the regressions, which we performed on this data software. So the first type of data analysis we did was descriptive statistics, which gives an overview of a data set. And the first type of descriptive statistics we did was a mean comparison test, which compared mean values of test optional versus non-test optional schools. And so here you can see we perform mean comparison tests for applications and total enrollment at institutions. And so you can see that following 2020, so starting in 2021, there's a significant difference in the total applications and enrollment of test optional versus non-test optional schools. And you can see this more clearly in these graphs as the total applications of the test optional schools in orange increased substantially following 2020, and same is true with the total enrollment of the test optional schools relative to the non-test optional. And so the next type of descriptive statistics we did were cross-sectional regressions, which shows the relationship between two variables analyzed at a specific time, or in this case at 1 year. And so each column in my data table is showing data from 1 year, 2016 through 2023. The dependent variable was test optional, and the independent variables were the different institutional characteristics, including size, region, location, Carnegie classification, which is like the type of institution, and then also demographics. And then this is answering what predicts if a school becomes test optional. So this is my whole data table generated from the regression, which was enrollment regressed with test optional. And so here are the coefficients for enrollment. And you can see that all of these coefficients are negative, showing there's a negative correlation between enrollment and test optional, meaning that large schools are less likely to be test optional. However, this relationship weakens over time. So as the years go on, even larger schools are also adopting test optional policies. And most of these coefficients lack significance, meaning that enrollment size doesn't predict test optional very well. And this is the region section of my cross-sectional regression. And this is showing how much more likely schools in each region are to become test optional relative to the omitted region, which was randomly selected to be the Southeast. And so as you can see here, schools in the New England and Mid-East regions of the United States were early adopters of test optional, as they were more likely to be test optional relative to the Southeast region. And then here you can see that the Great Lakes, Plains, Southwest, and Rocky regions had schools that were later adopters of test optional admissions, so post-pandemic, meaning that they were more likely to switch to be test optional relative to the Southeast region. And then as you can see here, the far west region was negative and significant post-pandemic, meaning that schools in this region were less likely to be test optional relative to the Southeast region post-pandemic. And this makes sense because the far west includes the University of California system schools that largely switched to test blind admissions rather than test optional, meaning that these schools didn't consider test scores at all. And the last type of data analysis we performed were fixed effects regressions, which shows variation across schools over time. And this is answering what is true about a school when it switches to test optional. And so here we regressed applications and enrollment with test optional, and we controlled for locale, region, and size of the school. And so you can see that when a school decides to switch to test optional, their applications are likely to increase by about 1,500, and their enrollment is likely to increase by about 40 students. And so because applications increase by a much larger factor than enrollment, these schools are also increasing in selectivity when they switch to test optional admissions. And so the future works of the study would be to see what the impact of test optional policies are on graduation rates and student success. And then also to see how schools are affected when they switch back to test requirements post-pandemic. And so I'd like to thank Dr. Collins, Abby McLean, Dr. Annabeth Soren, and my Hearst classmates.
Hi, I'm Jocelyn Oropeza, and this summer I worked with attorney Colton Bain at the Community Legal Center, and I looked at public perceptions and change in immigration law. So first, for some background on the history of American policy on immigration, anti-immigrant sentiment dates back all the way to the 1700s with the Naturalization Acts of 1790 and 1795, which only allowed white foreign males to be naturalized in the United States after residing in the US for only 2 years, notably excluding everyone else that was not a white male. And the first time that the United States excluded an entire ethnic group was through the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which excluded all Chinese immigrants from entering the country. Next, these two acts here are relatively more recent policy, and these show how quickly immigration law can change depending on who is in office. For example, the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed by President Reagan, and this actually created a pathway for a lot of undocumented immigrants to get legalization through their employer. However, through the 1996 Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, this was revoked and actually introduced expedited removal, which I will talk about later, and allowed for immigrants to be deported on minor acts such as shoplifting. So over the summer, I looked at different forms of legal status, and these are among the ones that I looked at. For asylum, withholding, and Convention Against Torture, or CAT, an applicant has to prove that they are being persecuted on one of the 5 protected grounds, which are race, religion, nationality, membership to a particular social group, or political opinion. Asylum is unique in that it has a 1-year requirement, meaning that an applicant has to have been in the United States for 1 year or less to be eligible, and they have to prove about a 10% chance of them being persecuted on one of these 5 grounds if they were to be deported to their home country. Withholding and CAT are different in that they don't have that 1 year requirement. However, there's a higher burden of proof. Instead of proving about a 10% chance of being persecuted, they have to prove about a 51% chance or higher of them being persecuted, or in the case of CAT, tortured upon their return to their home country. I also looked at U visas and T visas, which are protections for undocumented immigrants already living in the United States. U visas focus on immigrants that are victims of violent crimes like assault and rape, and T visas focus on those that are victims of labor law infractions. And finally, family petitions are for US citizens filing for immigrant family members. This graph shows how American perception on immigration law is very skewed. This survey asked Americans to predict how long they believed family petitions took. Of the people surveyed, 94% believed that family petitions took 7 years or less. And then of that 94%, 78% believed that it would take 3 years or less. And then of the 94, 60% believed it would take 1 year or less. Family petitions vary on how long they take, but they can average about 12 to 14 years, but actually can take up to 25 years to complete. So one of my main roles at the Community Legal Center this summer was being a translator. And by being a translator, I was able to see a lot of the obstacles that immigrants go through while trying to obtain legal status. One of the most prevalent issues I saw was legal scams, specifically notarios or notaries in the United States. Notario in Latin America is a legal expert. This person is highly educated because they have gone through law school. However, a notary in the United States is not required to have such a high education, as their job is to notarize or witness signatures and place a state seal on the signatures. However, a lot of Hispanic notaries take advantage of how similar these words are in translation and will illegally give legal advice to immigrants, or even go as far as filing false applications for them and charge them for these services. Next, language barriers. Coming to the US and it not being your first language or not speaking it at all is a barrier in itself, but it could be a bigger barrier for people coming from countries like Guatemala, where dialects are more prevalent than mainstream languages. And this can leads to more room for misinterpretation, as more translators would be needed. Like, for example, for a Guatemalan client, a translator would be needed to translate from the dialect to Spanish, and then another to translate from Spanish to English. Next, expedited removal is what I mentioned earlier, and this is a process of deporting immigrants at a much faster rate, which thus doesn't allow them to have due process. Because even if an immigrant is here in the United States undocumented, they're still supposedly protected under the US Constitution. And by deporting them at a much quicker rate, they are then prevented from getting legal help to defend their cases. And finally, voluntary departure. While this has been a thing for a long time, for the first time, we're seeing clients request this more. However, even this has its own requirements. If an immigrant is in immigration court, they have to request it upon the court. And to be able to obtain it, they have to prove that they have been a person of good moral character for the past 5 years, prove that they have the financial stability to leave the country on their own, and have the proper documentation to leave to whichever country they choose to. And depending on when they file for it, if they're given voluntary departure, they're given anywhere from 60 to 120 days to leave the country, and failure to do so can result in a $1,000 to $8,000 fine, among other punishments. My other role at the Community Legal Center was researching changes as they happened, and these all happened while I was during this summer. One of the most notable was the Board of Immigration Appeals ruling that gender is not considered being part of a particular social group, which is one of the 5 protected grounds for asylum, withholding, and CAT. This is essentially a disadvantage to a lot of women that use this to their advantage. For example, a lot of African women that fear female genital mutilation, or a lot of Middle Eastern women that fear persecution in their theocracies due to being a woman. So this means that they are not able to use the fact that they are women for the reason for their persecution, and would have to find a different reason. Next, a clause was added to the Tennessee bill on sex and human trafficking. Although this clause does not have to do much with human trafficking. Nonetheless, it was added to this, and it states that harboring or housing an undocumented immigrant is now considered a Class A misdemeanor, which could be trouble for landlords that are renting to and housing undocumented immigrants. And finally, 287G programs. These were pre-existing prior to the summer. However, they're being brought back under the Trump administration. And these essentially grant police officers powers of ICE agents. Like, for example, through the jail enforcement model, they're allowed to identify and process immigrants that have already been detained and arrested. The task force model allows them to question people on their legal status. And the warrant service officer program allows them to administer administrative warrants. This matters for not just immigrants to be aware about these scams and for them not to fall into them, but it matters for the greater public because immigration has always been a very hot topic in politics and at the center a lot of debates. And so knowing more about it, about how long it takes and what people actually have to go through in the processes will allow people to make a more educated vote on the matter. I would like to thank Attorney Colton Bain, Dr. Soren, and my Hearst classmates.
Hello, my name is Lucy Roberts, and over the summer, I worked with Dr. Mandel in the biology department at the University of Memphis. I studied the antimicrobial properties of plants from the University of Memphis Herbarium. Antimicrobial properties are the abilities of a substance to kill or inhibit the growth of microorganisms like bacteria, fungi, viruses, and parasites. Antimicrobial resistance is the ability of these microorganisms to resist the effects of antimicrobial substances. This is also called AMR. AMR can develop through two main ways. The first is mutation, which is a random change in the genetic material of a microorganism. And the second is acquisition, which is where a microorganism is able to obtain DNA from a different microorganism. Once AMR has developed in a population, it is able to spread through that population through natural selection, which is where a population of microorganisms is exposed to an antimicrobial substance, which kills all the microorganisms that are not resistant to it. And therefore, those microorganisms can no longer reproduce, meaning the frequency of this resistant trait is greater in the next population or next generation, and that continues until the whole population is resistant. AMR has been increasing greatly in the last few decades. This is largely due to an increased use of antibiotics, not only in people, but also in agriculture and livestock and aquaculture. And this all leads to a large amount of antibiotic entering the environment, which then increases the likelihood that these microorganisms will be exposed to antibiotic and will be able to form a resistance to it. If AMR continues to increase at the rate it has been increasing, it will have very drastic consequences. One of these is a very high death toll. As you can see in this graph, if AMR continues to increase at the same rate, by 2050, the death toll of AMR will be equivalent to the death toll of all cancers combined. In addition to this, increasing AMR will also increase health costs, as patients will have to pay for more drugs in order to find a drug that is actually effective against their specific microorganisms. And they'll have to pay for longer patient care and the development of new drugs as microorganisms become resistant to the current drugs. Plants are a major source of medicinal compounds. They're also a very efficient source of medicinal compounds, as these compounds already exist within the plants and do not need to be developed by researchers. Some common medicines that come from plants that you might know are aspirin, which comes from this willow bark, morphine, which comes from the opium flower, and caffeine, which can be found in coffee beans. For my experiment, I studied different plants in the University of Memphis Herbarium in order to identify whether they had antimicrobial properties. A herbarium is a storage center for dried, pressed, and preserved plants. The University of Memphis Herbarium alone has 20,000 plants, so I obviously wasn't able to test all of them. So the first thing I did was find a list of plants that I thought may have antimicrobial properties. This list included plants that were related to known antimicrobial plants and plants that are poisonous to pets. Once I had created this list, I collected samples from each of these plants, and then I extracted chemicals from these samples using this procedure. One important part of this procedure is that I separated the sample into two and then dissolved one half in water and the other in ethanol. And this is crucial as water and ethanol dissolve different compounds. So by using both of these, I was able to extract a greater variety of compounds. Once I had created the solution, I placed it on these filter paper discs you can see here, and then let that dry so that the water and ethanol would evaporate, leaving only the chemicals left on the discs. To actually test these samples, I tested them against 3 different bacteria, Bacillus cereus, Escherichia coli, and Staphylococcus aureus. I would spread a bacteria on a plate and then place discs and labeled locations on the plate, and then let that sit for 24 hours in order to give time for the bacteria to grow and the chemicals from the discs to seep into the plate, and if they were antimicrobial, to prevent the growth of bacteria around them, which you can see here in sample 112, where there's a blank space around the disc. I then measured this blank space in 4 different areas and averaged that in order to find the average effect on the bacteria. I then repeated this for several trials and averaged each of the effects that each sample had on each bacteria in order to find their effect. So out of the 90 total plants I tested, 27 had antimicrobial properties. This chart shows all 27. As you can see, I only included B. cereus and staph and not E. coli. This is because no plants had any effect on E. coli. This is likely because E. coli is a gram-negative bacteria, meaning it has a double membrane as part of its cell wall, while E. cereus and staph are gram-positive bacteria, so they only have a single membrane layer as part of their cell wall. So often antimicrobial substances will only be effective against either gram-positive or gram-negative. The next steps would be to analyze the chemicals I identified in order to determine which specific compounds were causing the antimicrobial properties. These compounds would then have to go through a long process in order to determine whether they would actually be effective antibiotics. Lastly, I would like to thank Dr. Jennifer Mandel, Ms. Judith Bowen, Dr. Annabeth Soren, and my Hearst classmates.
Hi, my name is Emma Thompson, and this summer I worked with Dr. Elizabeth Wellman in the Political Science Department at the University of Memphis on documenting the current state of regulations in place to allow for voting in the diaspora. Diaspora is defined by the dispersion or spread of people from their homeland. In this context, it refers to the part of the population that resides elsewhere. Due to globalization, there has been an increase in immigration, communication, and travel, which is shown in this graph from the United Nations. This graph shows the number of international migrants, which has increased significantly over time, and the migrants as a percentage of the total population, which has remained stagnant. This is due to the population of the world increasing and the number of international migrants increasing with it. Because of this, Dr. Wellman and her colleagues composed the Extraterritorial Voting Rights and Restrictions, or EVRR, dataset in order to encompass the changes in policies and procedures of these countries. This dataset covers 195 countries and has 24 separate variables for each country. A dataset like this is important for policies pertaining to voting in the diaspora. And so it varies greatly by both the country of origin and the country of permanent residence. To understand this dataset, you need to understand the terminology de jure versus de facto. De jure means in law, which means a law has been adopted that includes one of the variables such as diaspora voting. De facto means in fact, which means a law has been implemented. Implementation may change based on the incumbent power, but the law is usually much more resistant to this change. This map from the original data set shows the change in de jure and de facto voting from 1990 to 2020. So 2 things that I would like to point out from this are the increase in this 30-year period for diaspora voting, and also the discrepancy between de jure and de facto. you can see specifically in Africa, there's been, most of those countries had adopted a law pertaining to the diaspora voting, but not all of them had implemented this law. Prior to this summer, this data set covered 1970 to 2020. So this summer, I and other research assistants worked to update this data set to include the years 2021 to 2025. I covered these 26 countries highlighted in blue, and most of which were Spanish speaking. In order to systematically code the policies, we used this system. 2 indicated de jure yes and de facto yes. 1 indicates de jure yes, but de facto no, meaning I was not able to find evidence of implementation. 0 indicates de jure no and de facto no. .E indicates an absence of evidence, meaning I was not able to find concrete evidence of either implementation or adoption or not. .A indicates not applicable. This would apply in a situation where there was a variable that asked for voting for a national legislator, but that specific country did not have a national legislator. So you would code .A rather than 0 or .E. With each country, I would open up a working document that continued on the work of the previous coder. I had to familiarize myself with the legislation of this country because in order to effectively find change, I had to understand what it was up to 2020. Then I would go to the actual legislation or voting laws of each country and look for diaspora and out-of-country voting in their legislation. Then I would go to academic sources. If these were available, they were helpful in analyzing and understanding what the law was saying and what it meant for the citizens. And then I would look at news sources. This was the most helpful in determining implementation. Then I would gather these sources and number them starting off wherever the previous coder left off. This is an example of one variable that I coded. This is El Salvador's EVRR1, which says, does any current national law allow non-resident citizens to vote? Highlighted in red are the codes. So these 2 are the ones of the previous coder. So up to 2012, they did not have legislation for diaspora voting. Then in 2013, they adopted law. And then in 2018 and 2019, they started implementing this law, which is why I coded 2 and then I numbered my sources so that for reference. This was the result of all of the countries that I coded for EVRR1. The ones in gray are ones that I did not code, but the ones in dark blue are ones that had adopted legislation, including diaspora voting. The ones that you can see in light blue are the ones that did not. So most of these did adopt legislation for EVRR1. This map shows the difference between the de facto and de jure. So all of the countries highlighted had adopted a law, but the ones in dark blue were the ones that had implemented a law, but the ones in light blue are the ones that I was not able to find evidence of implementation. An example of how diaspora voting can affect a country's politics is El Salvador. So I had the opportunity to construct a timeline of El Salvador's relationship with diaspora voting law, focusing on political parties. So prior to 2019, they had a predominantly 2-party system. But in 2013, they adopted legislation that allowed for voting in the diaspora. And then 2019, Nayib Bukele was elected, and this was largely due to his successful engagement with the diaspora that the 2 dominant parties before that were not successful in. So he was part of a 3rd party. And since then, he has been reelected. And in July 2025, El Salvador adopted legislation that eliminated term limits. This is a significant change that occurred largely because of engagement with the diaspora. The next steps of this is that research will continue so that way EVRR can continue to be updating so that political scientists and analysts can use this to understand what is happening now with the diaspora and what might happen in the future with elections and diaspora voting. I would like to thank Dr. Elizabeth Wellman, Dr. Soren, and my HERS classmates.
Hi, I'm Maren Thompson, and I was able to work with Dr. Brooke Shannon at the University of Memphis Political Science Department, where I investigated causes of Tennessee preemption laws and their relation to the city of Memphis. So preemption is a legal doctrine that allows a higher level of government to prohibit or limit a lower level of government from legislating or passing policy on a particular issue. On the federal level, preemption works to create a unitary system of government powered by Congress, and it is dependent on both the political party of the president and of the majority party of Congress, because this dictates what types of laws are passed and also the amount of congressional oversight. On the state level, preemption is also dependent on the political party of the governor and of the state itself. And in the past 20 years or so, preemption has been shown to oftentimes override more progressive laws. Now, this is seen when more Republican states override progressive laws made by Democratic cities. And so city autonomy is based on either Dillon's rule or home rule. And Dillon's rule is a direct reflection of the 10th Amendment, which is states' rights. So municipalities are seen as agents of the state. This makes it harder for cities to pass laws that differ from state policy and what states want. And it also makes it a lot easier for states to pass preemption laws. Home rule allows for the state to grant authority on certain policy or issues to the city. So cities should have more autonomy to pass differing legislation, but this is counteracted by the rise in preemption. Tennessee, like most of the country, is a mixture of both Dillon's and home rule. So larger cities like Memphis, Nashville, and Knoxville, as well as Shelby County, are under a home rule charter. Now, the relevance to Memphis and Tennessee itself, there has been a rise in preemption passed by the Republican-controlled Tennessee Congress, overruling more progressive Memphis policy. As I have said, this has been a trend throughout the whole nation, but it is especially prevalent in Tennessee because of the extreme level to which they are preempting municipality legislation. And this has many adverse effects on the economy and safety of Memphians and minority groups, including people of color and immigrants. Now, if you look here, all these checked boxes are domains in which the state preempts local government. And these include firearms, election policies, and racism in the school curriculum. And if you look down here, Tennessee is the only state that preempts all of these domains. And so that shows the extremity to which Tennessee preempts laws. Now, methodology, me and Dr. Shannon wanted to see or look at why Tennessee has such a large amount of preemption laws on their more progressive Democratic cities. So we looked at Memphis and state demographics because these are variables that will affect legislation. So we looked at population based on both size and race, high school graduation rates, SNAP recipients, which are food stamps, and we used as an indicator for poverty and voter registration. And we cross-referenced all of these to show correlations with translations. And so that is what this would look like. And so the darker the blue, the stronger the correlation between the two variables in both the positive or negative direction. So if you look down here, we have high school graduation rates in Memphis cross-referenced to the total population of Memphis. And this is a strong negative correlation, meaning that the more people there are in Memphis, the fewer high school graduates there are. Now, directly under that, we have high school graduation rates in Tennessee and total population of Tennessee. And that is a strong positive correlation, which translates to the more people in Tennessee, the more high school graduates there are. Now, this just shows a difference in policy between the city and the state that might occur because Memphis legislators may want to make education more affordable and more accessible to raise those graduation rates, whereas the Tennessee legislature will not or might not deem that as important. We also found interesting correlations between SNAP recipients and total population. So the more people that lived in Memphis, the more people needed SNAP, and the opposite was true for Tennessee. And so that just shows another area of tension and difference that could lead to preemption in the future. Further, I looked at legislation itself, first with the Benjamin Hooks policy papers, and these are issues from 2014 to 2024 on relevant Memphis or Tennessee problems or issues, and they all include implications for change on both the city and the state level. From these issues, we were able to look at issues to gather search terms that we then cross-reference to Tennessee legislation from 2021, 2023, and 2025 regarding major municipalities. And so that is what this looks like here. These bills are all from 2025, and they have the description and the search term or terms relevant. And so if you look here, these are some of the most common terms that we found: immigration, healthcare, especially abortion, and anything prison or law and crime related. So we can take the immigration one, for example. A lot of these state bills on immigration more so revolved around stricter immigration and deportation laws, whereas on the Memphis level from the Hooks papers, we found that immigration policy was much more lenient and was more towards having immigrants come and acclimating to the city. And so this just creates an area of tension, and we believe that from these search terms, we can see which issues are more likely to be preempted. And so this is just a closer look at that. We have all of the search terms from the Hooks papers down here, and the density or prevalence in the legislation that they were in. And so we have healthcare, education, more so higher education and college, and then law and crime were the most prevalent. And so from this, we believe that because these terms and issues were discussed and deliberated a lot on both the city and the state level, that these are the areas where preemption is most likely to occur. And so this is still ongoing research. I was able to join Dr. Shannon at the beginning of this project, so I laid a lot of the foundation work. And so further down the line, she will be looking at why Memphis legislators and policymakers continue to make policy that they know will be preempted and their reasonings behind that. And I would like to thank Dr. Shannon, Ms. Wright, Dr. Soren, and my HERS classmates.
Hi, my name is Elena Wade, and I spent the summer with the chemistry department at the University of Memphis under Dr. Charles Gardner, looking for new organic reactions using gas chromatograph instruments and heterogeneous catalysis discovery. So just a little background about what a catalyst is, and specifically heterogeneous catalysis. A catalyst is a substance that speeds up the rate of a chemical reaction without it undergoing any compositional changes or being consumed within the reaction. And heterogeneous catalysis specifically is when your catalyst is in a different physical phase than your reactants. So say your catalyst is in a solid phase, whereas your reactants are in a liquid or a gaseous phase. And this image here just kind of depicts the reactant and the catalyst in their different phases. And we specifically looked at hydrogenation reactions using alkenes as our reactants with the catalyst. And an alkene is a hydrocarbon, and a hydrocarbon is a compound consisting of hydrogen and carbon atoms, but an alkene is an unsaturated hydrocarbon with the double bond. And a hydrogenation is when hydrogen gas reacts with an unsaturated compound, in this case, an alkene. And so this reaction mechanism occurs as an alkene reacts with the hydrogen gas to form an alkane in its unsaturated form. And this is important because looking for new organic reactions and catalysts have so many positive impacts. For example, 90% of chemical manufacturing processes rely on catalysts, and sustainability in the environment, and looking for new pharmaceutical development. And it also drives mechanistic understanding. And by that, I mean looking for new reaction mechanisms and being able to understand them. We can apply them to so many different areas and fields. And just by looking for new products and reactions, we can just see what type of impact that might have. And this image here just visually depicts how a hydrogenation mechanism is. And so you see here your hydrogen atoms attached to the catalyst surface along with your alkene. Those two hydrogen atoms then will be transferred to an alkane in the end. It will lose its double bond and it will gain those two hydrogen atoms. And so we did this by using a gas chromatograph, which is an analytical tool for separating and quantifying and identifying volatile components and mixtures. And this is an image of the gas chromatograph we used. And so first you will prepare your catalyst and insert it into the column, which sits within the bed of the chromatograph. And then you will measure out your alkene reactant in a 20 microliter syringe. And I would inject it into this inlet here, and it would run through the catalyst bed while hydrogen was being flowed throughout the chromatograph.
And then you would collect the product and run it through a mass spectrometer, which analyzes the reaction and what products are formed. And this is an image of what the chromatograph graph looks like, the mass spectrometer graph looks like. And here are some of the peaks that are identified. And these show each compound in itself as the reaction is proceeding. And it shows what time the reactant or product comes through. As you can see here, this reactant came in at about 2.5 minutes, and this product here came in about 4.5 minutes. And then the bottom graph shows the specific characteristics of each individual peak and their mass spectra data and their abundance. And so we specifically looked at how temperature is affecting these hydrogenation reactions, because there's a lot of speculation about whether hydrogenation reactions are being favored at lower or higher temperatures. Hydrogenation reactions typically should be favored at lower temperatures because they are exothermic. And the specific substrates or reactants we used were methylcyclohexene, tetraline, and dichlorophenol with the catalyst of rhodium platinum, 70% rhodium, 30% platinum. And so one example was our tetraline hydrogenation that produces a cis and a trans decalin. The difference between cis and trans is it's the same molecule with the same number of atoms and chemical formula. They're just arranged differently throughout the molecule. So with a cis, it's going to be the hydrogen is on the same side, whereas the trans will be on opposite sides of each other. And we found that lower temperatures were favored, meaning there was more product yield within these reactions. And then another example was the methylcyclohexene hydrogenation. And we actually found that higher temperatures were favored here. And with that, we observed the formation of toluene, which is typically present in dehydrogenation reactions, which is the removal of hydrogen. But all hydrogenation catalysts are also dehydrogenation catalysts. And so with the higher temperature, you're going to see an increased presence of toluene because it's an endothermic reaction. And so endothermic requires greater temperature to see the formation of toluene. And this just indicated that there are many secondary pathways that can occur under different catalysts and temperature conditions. And then these are the graphs from the mass spectrographs from this reaction. And this is the product cyclohexane, which is the saturated alkane product. And this is the presence of toluene. You can see the cyclohexane is higher in abundance than the toluene. And then overall, we just observed that the difference in temperature yields varies due to the alkene and the type of catalyst. And for the future, we could try to look at new reactants and try different carrier gases such as helium or nitrogen. And we could just look for greater yields and more product formation and do more trials. And I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Garner, Dr. Soren, and all my HERS classmates. Hi, my name is Parker Wells, and over the summer, I researched at the University of Memphis under the mentorship of Dr. Beth Meisinger, and my topic was teacher preparedness for elementary school students' literacy. So starting with my research questions were whether or not teacher textbooks are preparing educators to transition students from oral silent reading, and whether or not dialectical differences are being addressed in the classroom. This graph shows the present issue with children's literacy in the United States. And as you can see, 34% of children entering kindergarten lack the basic skills needed to learn how to read. 67% of fourth graders read below grade level, which contributes to 8,000 students dropping out of high school every single day. And only 37% of students graduate high school at or above reading proficiency, which means that the other 63% of these children are graduating below their reading proficiency. And this chart shows the difference in COVID and how that impacted children's literacy. And so as you can see, grade 4 reading and grade 4 math, as well as grade 8 reading and grade 8 math all decreased from 2019 to 2022, which shows the results of COVID. And during COVID, a lot of kids can't get to school because their parents are working or they're doing online school or they're in cohorts. And there's just a lot of issues that they are absent from school and so they can't be in class. Currently, there is a controversial debate among educators regarding what is the correct age to transition students from oral to silent reading. From what I researched this summer, the most common age to start transitioning students from oral silent reading is 4th grade. However, I saw as early as 2nd grade and as late as 6th grade. And some of the reasons why children can't meet their reading levels are because teachers are expecting students to automatically be able to transition from being read to aloud in a class and being in a classroom environment into reading silently by themselves, like in the corner of a classroom, a full chapter book. And a common tactic that's used among schools in the United States is DEAR, which means drop everything and read. And this is a time in which every single day students are told to drop all the work they're doing, any assignments they're completing, go pick a book up from the bookshelf with any topic they like, and sit in a specific spot in a classroom and read for increments of about 20 minutes per day. However, if the students have not accurately been transitioned from oral to silent reading, they're sitting there looking at words on a page that they can't comprehend and not being able to learn or further their education in any way. The second portion of the project that I researched this summer was dialect. And the dialect I focused on was AAVE, which is African American Vernacular English. And this is a common dialect among the United States, but a bunch of teachers don't want to address this dialect because they have a fear of being insensitive or insulting their students when they're trying to tell them the difference between AAVE and mainstream English. These two graphs show the different words in AAVE and the translation in AAVE, as well as the different tenses in AAVE. And so as you can see on the left, these are words that are in AAVE and the translation. And another common word that's used a lot in AAVE is the word crib. And to students that speak AAVE with an AAVE dialect, the word crib can mean a neighborhood or a house. However, in mainstream English, the word crib means a structure where an infant sleeps. And then this just shows the different tenses of AAVE and how they're different than mainstream English. So what my role was in researching this summer was I reviewed 6 literature textbooks that regarded teacher preparedness, and they ranged in length from 144 pages to 560 pages. Some of these textbooks had indexes. However, one of the textbooks that I reviewed did not have an index, and with a book that did not have an index, I would have to skim every single page for the search term list, which will be shown in a second, while as when there was an index, I was able to go through with the alphabetized search term list starting in the index. This was one of the cheat sheets that the grad students that I worked with created to make sure that none of the data we were collecting was out of the scope of the project. And so if I saw any of these terms in any of the textbooks I was reviewing, I would then go and record them in an Excel spreadsheet, as they are indicators that signal that students are ready to silently read and make that transition from oral to silent reading. This was another one of the cheat sheets we used, and this shows the dialect portion of the project. And so if I saw any words such as AVE or accent or code switching, I would then look to the right side of this image to the inclusion criteria and decide whether or not I was going to record this in the Excel spreadsheet. And a lot of the words that were used in relevance to oral reading or the transition between oral and silent reading can be used in many different instances. For example, the word oral reading was only relevant to this project if it was talking about the transition from oral to silent reading and how related to silent reading. So if it was just talking about oral reading in general, I didn't need to record that. Another one of the columns that I was filling in on an Excel spreadsheet was the different 5 pillars of literacy and which data corresponded to which of the 5 pillars of literacy. The 5 pillars of literacy are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Phonics is the smallest of the 5 pillars of literacy, meaning that it is the letters that we decode in our head. Phonemic awareness is very similar to this. However, it's just how well we can take the letters that we see on a page and put them into words in our brains. Fluency is the rate at which we can read. Vocabulary is how many words we can comprehend in our brain and automatically decode in our heads. And then comprehension is basically just how skilled you are at reading and how quickly you can form sentences and read stories and process them in your brain. This image on the right shows the Excel spreadsheet that I was using to record all of my data. And so as you can see, what I just discussed, the literacy area is on the right, the excerpt, which is the specific data I was recording, the description, which is just a summary of the data I was recording, the section title, page number, and textbook title. And as we do not have firm results, because I was in the preliminary stages of this project, from what I saw this summer, there's not nearly enough information regarding the transition between oral to silent reading, and there's not nearly enough information regarding dialect in any of the textbooks I reviewed. So these are 2 examples of the textbooks I reviewed, but Teaching Reading in the 21st Century mentioned the transition between oral to silent reading 7 times and didn't mention any of the search terms for the dialect portion whatsoever in the textbook. And Qualitative Reading Inventory 7 mentioned the transition between oral to silent reading 9 times, but only mentioned dialect once. However, when it mentioned dialect, it was not solely about dialect. It was a subheading under the English language learners section, which refers to students that are learning a completely new language. So if a student is in a classroom that speaks Spanish and is learning English, they're being grouped sometimes with students who have an AAVE dialect, and that's not really the same level of learning and can slow down the education and the literacy rates of a lot of children. So the next steps for my project is that the grad students I was working with are submitting a poster to NASP, which is the National Association of School Psychology, in February. And they're hoping to bring awareness to all the teachers on how to address dialect in the classroom, as well as how to better transition students from oral to silent reading. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Beth Meisinger at the University of Memphis, my grad students that I work closely with, and Dr. Shorn and my HERS classmates.